Hi, Dave. Good to see you. How are you?
Good to see you too. Looking forward to this.
You see how it's meant to be.
Sure. Yeah.
Five two, yeah. So you see when there's a gas, so that now that goes 20 so quick.
Oh wow, really choosing sponsors. Why?
Right, so welcome to the IRDR monthly seminar. So we have Ksenia Trumtina from Loughborough University talking today. So Ksenia is a reader in sustainable and resilience engineering. Her research focuses on the processes of urban disaster, risk creation, and systemic implications of sustainability and resilience in the context of neoliberalism. I think with that, I should stop and over to you.
Thank you so much. Hi everyone. It's really nice to be here. Nice to be able to see you all in person. I haven't given an in-person lecture, I was just saying to Peter, for about 2.5 years. So you know, if this goes wrong, I do apologize. But let's try. Anyway, I thought I'd start with this story that is familiar to us all, right? And this is a story of 3 little pigs. It's probably not a story that you heard before, because I actually went and spoke to pigs. I wanted to learn a little bit more about them because this is what we do when we think about disasters and the context. So once upon a time, there were 3 little pigs, and they were all really good friends, and they were neighbors, and they played together all the time. And one day, of course, they grew up and they wanted to go and live on their own. And all along, as they were growing up, they were told that there is a big bad wolf out there. So the first little pig lived with his poorly grandma, and she gave him all love and care in the world, but she was really ill, and so the little pig needed to go and fetch the water. He needed to care for his grandma, and he was really, really tired all the time. He also needed to fetch food, and it was usually scraps, but the grandma made sure that it's delicious. He didn't have time to go to school, and all the other pigs thought that he's just lazy and stupid, but they've never checked. And the second little pig, she lived with her mother, and her mother made sure that her little pig goes to school and really learns skills. But also, at the same time, her mother didn't really have much to give. And so when her little pig grew up, her mother gave her some coins and kind of said, off you go. And then there was a third little pig who lived with his father, who also gave him all love and care in the world, as well as a piece of gold. And so when the third little pig grew up, he went off with his piece of gold, and he was really quite happy with that. And so the first little pig, not having any money, just went and found some straw, and he was so proud of himself for being able to put together this really cute, cozy little house made out of straw. The second little pig used her coins to buy some branches. She didn't have enough money to buy all the branches she needed for her house, but nevertheless, she put this house together, and she also went and found work so she can build a better house in the future. And the third little pig used a piece of his gold to build a really nice, solid brick house. And of course, he then put all the other gold in a piggy bank, and he employed the second little pig to build a house for him, but he didn't pay her much. And so, they all lived happily in their houses. But one day a wolf came sniffing around, and the wolf was really hungry as anything, and he thought, tonight I'm going to have at least one of those pigs for dinner. And so the wolf knocked on the first pig's door, from the house that was made of straw. And he said, little pig, let me in. And the pig, of course, didn't let him in. And the wolf huffed and puffed and blew the house down. And the first little pig ran to his friend and neighbor, knocked on the house made out of branches and said, please help. And the second little pig opened the door, and they were both kind of hiding behind the door, trembling. And the wolf said, little pigs, let me in. And they didn't. So the wolf huffed and puffed and blew the house down. And so the little pigs ran to the third house of the third pig, made out of brick, that solid, nice house. They knocked on the door, and they ran as fast as they could run. But the first little pig was lacking nutrition. And, he was also really tired of all the hard work they had to do since he was a kid. And so he couldn't run very fast. And so the wolf got him and ate him. The second little pig made it to the brick house, and he knocked and knocked. But the third little pig wouldn't open the door. And so the wolf caught the second little pig and ate him. And then the wolf started knocking on the third little pig's door and said, open the door. But the third little pig wouldn't open the door. And the wolf puffed and huffed, and he couldn't blow the house down because that house was so solid. And he ran away crying. And the third little pig, took his phone and kind of tweeted, the world is crazy, and there are wolves out there, and they're coming here all the time. But it's okay, I'm safe. And so perhaps this is not quite the bedtime story that you wish to tell your children, or you were told that as a kid, but the premise is the same, right? What is considered best practices when it comes to risk management and disaster risk reduction? And the emphasis is all applying appropriate technology or kind of appropriate knowledge, in this case, brick house, to withstand the perceived hazard. In this case, it's a wolf-induced strong winds. And that kind of came to constitute the way that we think and consider disaster risk reduction, particularly on a policy level, and then we implement it in real life. And it's assumed that people are at risk, simply end up at risk because they kind of end up in the wrong place at the wrong time. And the proper response is to apply the ingenuity, right? Is to apply the technology and knowledge that we have to protect ourselves from risk. But what this story is really telling us, particularly if we care to think about these 3 little pigs that we meet in our story, is that it's not a big bad wolf that creates disasters, right? And that moreover, we usually know about the big bad wolf, but we don't have resources to protect ourselves, or in fact, we are prevented from protecting ourselves. And furthermore, we criticize those who lack resources, right? And we also portray a privilege as virtue. And this is what we're going to talk about today for the next 30 minutes or so. I want to explore whether it is the wolf that we need to care about, or whether it's the narratives and framings of the wolf and kind of the hazards and the disasters further when we talk about disaster risk reduction. Or should we instead focus on the framing of vulnerability, and if we don't, whether that leads to disaster risk reduction? So what is disaster risk reduction? Well, United Nations disaster risk reduction gives us a pretty clear definition, and they further explore what disaster risk is. And it's great. It has all the buzzwords here. We have sustainable development, we have capacity, we have vulnerability, exposure, you name it. It's all here in this definition. So what's the problem? If we know what we're doing, then why disasters still happen? Why do we still need to talk about disaster risk creation? What is disaster risk creation? Well, James Lewis and Ilan Kalman in 2017, in their paper, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, provided an insight in what disaster risk creation is. And I'm not going to read the slide for you, you can see it here. But in summary, what disaster risk creation or disaster risk reduction are the actions and inactions, as well as acts of omission and commission that center hazard as a kind of responsible for disaster risk. And I don't think it will come to any of you as a shock that, for the last 50 years, well, instead, even kind of 300 years, we've been talking about the fact that hazards and disasters are not the same, and that hazards do not need to turn into disasters. The no-natural disasters argument is not new. I'm sure you've seen the campaign, right, on social media, and it's been going on for forever, kind of starting with Rousseau's letter and then the seminal paper of O'Keefe and colleagues. And whilst I'm not going to dwell on no-natural disasters today, and I will only come back to it kind of for a second later on, this is really, really important, nevertheless, when we talk about disaster risk. So if we know all of this, if we know how to reduce disaster risk, why disasters still happen? Well, this is because disasters are political as well as they're not natural. And this is what I would like to really explore. And let me start with a little bit of history, because really the roots of both neoliberalism and disaster risk reduction as a element of development, they really are displayed at kind of the same historic moment. So one of the roles of capitalist state is to mediate unrest. And disaster is a possibility for the unrest, not in a sense of kind of panic or riot, but as an opportunity for spontaneous alternatives to transformation. And as you can imagine, Second World War, of course, provided that opportunity to resist, right? The kind of the present, that present formation. It was an opportunity for radical action. However, as powerful actors considered what is going to happen with the world after the Second World War, they sought to maintain their power and they sought to maintain the dominance of the capital. So the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference was convened at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods in July '44. And it brought together the 44 member nations of the Allied power in an effort to kind of figure out, how would the world move towards the reconstruction after the destruction and disruption that was brought by the Second World War. And so the Allied nations proposed a two-pronged approach. The first aim was to restabilize the markets and currencies. And the second aim was kind of to consider the physical reconstruction of course, destruction that the war brought. And the approaches, both of these approaches were rooted in this fundamental belief in prosperity. And the prosperity was believed to be brought by development because the prosperity was seen as a stabilizing factor to kind of future peaceful world. And to enact this two-pronged approach, the International Monetary Fund was introduced and the World Bank. So International Monetary Fund for finance and World Bank for kind of looking after development and reconstruction. And the method to bring about this prosperity was seen to be done through growth, because it was kind of, and the growth was involved on globalized and urbanized world. But what we need to remember is that, of course, these ideas and ideals of the post Second World War world were brought about and very much influenced by the nations like the United States and not the colonial members, not the post-colonial states. And so the post-war system, also known as Fordism, kind of was very much reliant on the mass consumption fueled by the organized mass production. But we've seen that there was a massive transformation in the 1970s when post-Fordism was kind of, well, Fordism was no more, and we moved towards neoliberalism, which was very much driven not by the nations, but a much more globalized approach where the state would play under the rules of a globalized market, right? And so the state would have to kind of comply with the rules and regulations of a much more globalized power. And disaster risk reduction frameworks, they also had to take the transformation, because in the 50s and 60s, the orientation of disaster risk reduction was very much nation by nation state. And so after the 60s, we started seeing the transformation at how, at a kind of more international approach towards disaster risk reduction. And I'm sure you're all aware that in 1987, the UN General Assembly announced that the 1990s will be the international decade for natural disaster reduction. And the whole aim of this decade was to foster international cooperation and to kind of to share technical knowledge, to share best practices, and to just kind of work together to create to resist disaster risks. And of course, perhaps the most important point of the decade, the international decade, was the meeting in 1994 in Yokohama, which led to the creation of the Yokohama strategy that emphasized that disaster relief is not enough, and we need to really think about mitigation, prevention, and preparedness. And consequently, the body coordinating disaster risk effort was created. So we now know it as UNDRR, but its previous name was United Nations International Strategy for Disaster Risk Reduction, IRDR. In 2002, the World Summit also took place. The World Summit on Sustainable Development took place in Johannesburg. And this is important because that was the first point where sustainable development, post-disaster reconstruction, and also disaster mitigation were recognized as having the same goals, right, in terms of development. And after a decade of the Yokohama strategy, UN kind of did the UN thing, got the members together, and so Hyogo Framework for Action was introduced in 2005. And the main shift there was that Hyogo Framework acknowledged the unequal damages and the unequal impacts resulting from disasters, and that is the product directly or indirectly of inequalities that are present in different societies. And then finally, so the current system that kind of we're under in disaster risk reduction is, of course, Sendai Framework for Action, which was for disaster risk reduction that was, of course, introduced in March 2015, and that is setting the goals and ideas for the IRDR until the 2030. And so here the examination of inequality became really, really prominent. And Hyogo, or Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, really emphasizes the understanding of vulnerability, right? So risk is no longer viewed as natural phenomena, and that is really, really important. And of course, the kind of the definition that United Nations for Disaster Risk Reduction provides has also changed quite significantly if we trace the history of all these frameworks, because now it highlights the disruption of the functioning of society, right? And this disruption happens due to the other risk factors, as UN puts them, meaning that if an earthquake happens in an uninhabited area, most probably we would not call that a disaster, right? And that is really important shift. So as such, this definition is really closely related to the ideas captured by the notions of sustainable development, as I already mentioned earlier. So if these instruments are in place, right, then if this definition is kind of all-encompassing and allows us to consider vulnerability and root causes of disasters, why are we still not succeeding in tackling disaster risks? So, okay. Even the slide don't change anymore. All right, here we go. So last year, together with quite a few of my colleagues from around the world, we've decided to do a reflective exercise because we were really quite curious to understand how and whether sustainable development goals indicators and Sendai framework for action indicators are used in measuring progress and whether these indicators actually align. And so we've done quite a lot of, Zoom meetings where we just went through every single indicator, trying to understand whether those indicators of the SDGs are useful in terms of understanding the root causes, right? The root causes of vulnerability. And when we looked at the indicators, it of course became apparent that the definition of disaster that United Nations, that UNDRI is using, that we've just seen on the previous slide, and that highlights that exposure, vulnerability, and capacity, does not actually match the indicators that measure progress towards disaster risk reduction. So the 2030 agenda has led to the formal adoption of Sendai framework indicators by sustainable development process. The UNDR states, and I quote, "Both the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction and the SDGs outcomes are a product of interconnected social and economic processes. As such, there is a lot of synergy between the two policy instruments. And more specifically, UNDR states, and I quote again, there are 25 targets related to DRR in 10 of the 17 SDGs. And so there are 3 goals, goal 1, goal 11, and goal 13. In their targets 1.5, 11.5, 11B, and 13.1 that have been adopted completely by the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. So they're identical with SDGs. And this is how the two instruments are really explicitly connected. However, this doesn't happen beyond the indicators that measure disaster losses or that measure national strategies for disaster risk reduction, right? So they're very hazard specific. And so although the rhetoric of Sendai framework is very, very much around appreciation of root causes, right? Very much around the kind of creation of vulnerability, the measurement of the progress or the data that is collected to measure the progress towards disaster risk reduction remains very event and hazard centric. And this is the problem, right? This is precisely what the problem is. Health, so SDG 3, gender disparities, SDG 5, poverty, SDG 1, denied access to education, land tenure, access to services. We can keep going on with all the SDGs, are all manifestations of the root causes of disasters and could inform or even address root causes, right? And they could really play a role in informing how we measure progress towards disaster risk reduction. And in fact, Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction uses the word development 103 times on its 27 pages. But development data is not then utilized in the way that the progress is measured. And so Sendai framework indicators shift, therefore, their attention away from the systemic inequalities, from injustice, from exploitation, and they really neglect the economic and political conditions that produce vulnerability by focusing on just hazards. And so they don't enable practitioners to really grapple with the idea of how vulnerability is produced in time and space. And furthermore, they don't provide a comprehensive picture of how disaster risk is actually created, because we know that disaster risk is not just about hazard. And so, you know, in this paper, we're not arguing that sustainable development goals are the way to go. Not at all. It was kind of a critical reflective exercise. And we're not arguing that they're more effective than Sendai framework for action, but rather we wanted to highlight a missed opportunity for convergence. That was really our intention. Because if the intention is to truly develop mechanisms that measure progress or setback in disaster risk, then we need to move away from the understanding of disasters as kind of events or hazard-focused events. And instead, we need to recognize that disasters are a manifestation or kind of delayed manifestation of structural violence and inequality. We know that structural housing stability and access to safe utilities plays a huge role when it comes to resilience, right? So why aren't we talking about this? We know that gendered violence plays a role in how communities experience disasters. So if we think along the gendered lines, why we're not talking about femicide, for example, in Sendai framework for action. We also know that income inequality plays a huge role in creating precarity and therefore hazard risk. And so if the aim of disaster risk reduction is to reduce the number of people directly affected without addressing the actual root causes of disasters, then we are playing quite a dangerous technocratic game. And that can really be easily thrown off when the next hazard comes. And this is where a whole kind of different narrative comes to play. And that is the narrative of resilience, which is kind of promoted as a solution to all our problems. So what does resilience mean to you in one word? What comes to mind when we say resilience? Any shouts?
Jargon.
Jargon, great. I hope somebody would say that. Yeah, please.
The ability to bounce back.
Yeah, so kind of, yeah, bounce back. Yeah, good. Anything else? Peter, any?
When you're bending a piece of metal, how the strength of
the strength. Yeah. Okay, yeah, please.
Think of a plant growing out of cracks of dry land or asphalt or something.
I like that. Okay, so kind of the ability to thrive, right? Almost to survive. Great. Okay, so I think, you know, this few answers was really quite a nice summary of how resilience is understood. And it is, I think, many of us have spent hours in different conference rooms arguing about the meaning of resilience, you know, because this is what we academics like to do. And you know, there is no single definition of resilience. In fact, some argue that kind of malleability and this nebulousness of the concept is really quite useful. But when we look at the summary of how resilience is used in disaster risk reduction context, really the concept very much focuses on kind of surviving high impact, relatively low frequency events, and then to get very quickly back to the basic function, right? That is a very standard, kind of very simple definition or understanding. And so resilience for a long time has indeed been focusing on kind of bouncing back or bouncing back to normal. But the implication of using this type of understanding of resilience tends to reduce everything to emergency response, right? And kind of very, very short-term response. And the emphasis is therefore on the short-term damage, and then we go back to normal, kind of to the original state. And then, so many started asking questions whether we should be going back to normal when the normal was affected by a disaster, right? And what normal actually means. And so, rather than seeking to bounce back, you know, failures, crises, and disasters may actually be an opportunity to bounce forward, right? And this is something that many people started arguing towards, you know, so resilience is bouncing forward exercise. However, what this opportunity to bounce forward means may have different interpretations. There is a very thin line for some to use this opportunity to actually fall forward and rebuild stronger and in a more just manner. Or another opportunity to actually consider disaster as this unique window to push away unwanted communities and jump on a bandwagon of kind of neoliberal urban planning that seeks economic profit rather than social justice. And so bouncing forward very often ends up being about recreating the inequalities, right? Or in fact, enhancing the inequalities that were in the original state before a disaster. And yet this idea seems to dominate very much. And particularly, it has been made really popular with the Building Back Better slogan. Because, you know, who doesn't want the better, right? We all want better. So the slogan of Building Back Better accompanies resilience, you know, for quite a couple of decades now, and in many political debates. I think for those of us in disaster scholarship, you know, we are used to Building Back Better. We've heard it probably, you know, even before Bill Clinton really popularized it after the Boxing Day tsunami. But then in 2020, many of us were kind of surprised, I suppose, by this sudden, strange revitalization of Building Back Better. On June 30th of 2020, the UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson promised to undertake, and I quote, "the most radical reforms for our planning system since the Second World War, as this will help to build back better, build back greener, build back faster," end of quote. In order to boost, and he was talking about kind of boosting the spending on infrastructure and of course the whole leveling up agenda, right? Then we heard Justin Trudeau also talking about Building Back Better. We heard the European Commission, and then the kind of the highlight of the Building Back Better rejuvenation was, of course, Joe Biden's first campaign and now the presidency, right? The kind of the website for Biden's presidency is Building Back Better. And so the emphasis of Building Back Better is on continuity. In other words, to keep ongoing no matter what. So the goal of Building Back Better is not to alleviate the root causes, right? Is not to alleviate the underlying political, economic, or social inequalities and structures, but actually to rather move past them as quickly as possible and go back to normal. And this emphasis is really the core of neoliberalism. Not as, and I don't mean neoliberalism as a kind of mode of economic management, but as a kind of political rationality and governmental reasoning that constructs and regulates the realm within which disasters happen. And contradiction here is that a disaster exposes, and of course it is grounded in the underlying inequalities, whereas neoliberal capitalism relies on these inequalities to maintain itself. So in a disaster, people lose their livelihoods, they lose shelter, they lose family, they lose sense of dignity, they lose infrastructure that they need to have daily life, to make their daily lives possible. But we also know that disasters, of course, do not affect everybody equally. And those at the margins and in our day-to-day existence are also the same people who are most harmed by disasters. And for the marginalized, disasters are not new, they're not sudden, they're not shocks. They're not unexpected. It is just a continuation of everyday harm that the society exposes them to. And so here, disaster doesn't simply bring suffering, it exposes suffering. For those who have no voice in decision making, who has no access to political participation, and who perhaps relies on kind of meager natural resources for their livelihood, trauma, suffering, displacement are not new to just disaster, right? It doesn't happen only in disaster context. And characterized as a way to, for people to sort of, and societies to become more resilient, Building Back Better epistemizes the problematic ideology of resilience. Disasters are often portrayed in resilient context, in resilience narrative, as unexpected and kind of sudden shocks. And they're also frequently naturalized and framed as something inevitable. And that means that the root causes cannot be addressed, and it is we who must change, right? And that is the narrative of neoliberal resilience. resilience and its ability to kind of to resolve all the problems, contemporary issues, has really been used as kind of this neoliberal narrative to explain absolutely everything, from how we as individuals deal with shocks and risks and disasters, to actually how we mainstream our approaches to international development. Portrayed as something good, resilience has been used as this kind of aspiration, you know. And of course, we all want to be good, right? We all want to be resilient, because why wouldn't you want to become good and resilient? But the problem is that under neoliberal conditions, this kind of aspiration for goodness, right, aspiration for resilience, can be interpreted as the ability to survive no matter what, right? So the ability to survive under conditions of destitution. And such resilience is profitable, because resilient people, and I quote, will absorb the impact of austerity measures and continue to be productive, as sociologist Sarah writes. So as such, resilience message essentially tells more oppressed and kind of more marginalized people to take knock after knock, no matter what, right, and just get better at coping. That is the overall message. And so I want to emphasize here that this political framing of otherwise neutral words is really what contributes to disaster risk reduction or disaster risk production. And disaster terminology is always contested, but too often we treat the concepts and the terms that we use as apolitical. And you know, because we feel that we're just building a better world, right? That's all we're doing. But whose world are we building, you know, and whose better are we interpreting and using as a benchmark for better? Well, largely Western, really, given that the words that we're using in disaster risk reduction are very much Anglophone. So disaster-related policies is usually global in their outreach. You know, we talked about Sendai framework, and there are many others. And so a couple of years ago, my colleague Jason von Medden and I were really curious about terminology in general. And we, with the help of friends and colleagues all around the world, we were kind of really lucky enough to get translation in 53 languages of the 6 terms that we use so widely in disaster risks. And these were resilience, vulnerability, capacity, risk, hazard, and disaster. And so then we looked at the translation of these terms with the help of our colleague and friend, who is a linguist, Dr. Neil Sadler. And so what we found wasn't really surprising. The way that disaster terms are used, and you know, consequently the problems that they're trying to solve and to address and frame, are very much grounded in English language hegemony. So the use of Anglophone terminology and underlying meaning among NGOs, researchers, you know, kind of non-governmental, international, intergovernmental actors really enforces powers by creating the language norms by which we get published, by which we get funding, you know, and by which we get policy buy-in. But these meanings are limited. We might see translation as quite a kind of mechanical exercise almost, right? That just produces the equivalent of meaning between languages. But of course, for those of us who, you know, speak more than one language, we know that translation is a much more creative exercise, right? It's much more creative, it's much more ambiguous. Because of long-standing power differentials, translation out of English is actually usually done through foreignizing. And so foreignizing means that it emulates the original. But we see the reverse dynamic when we are looking at the translation of kind of terminology back from the original language. And this is where domesticating approach is used that masks the origin. So for example, you know, reading a translation might eventually see resilience, whereas in the original source, it was something more like bouncy, right? And we see the same with vulnerability, for instance, where it's very often being translated as wound or weakness and may lead to labeling people. Is this what we want in disaster risk reduction? What could we learn about disasters if we actually listen to how people talk about disasters, right? And how what words they use, what meanings they're implying. what would it do for the framing of disasters if we were much more nuanced in our understanding? How could it help us to resist disaster risk creation? These are the questions that we really need to ask as we move forward. And so, as I already noted at the start of this talk, development ideas have really been prominent and in driving the formation of disaster risk reduction efforts and practice. And gradually they have become intertwined. Certain ideas were imposed on fledgling disaster risk field, economic growth as prerogative, the West as the savior of the world, whilst erasing kind of the wants and needs of the global South. These ideas, again, are very clearly reflected in the narratives of building back better and resilience, where the focus is on building back, and that is very much grounded in in economic growth. And we see the prioritization of the speed of, say, physical reconstruction rather than alleviation of inequalities and oppression. And by arguing that disasters are developmental problems, we fail to recognize that current terms of engagement allow the powerful to show disasters as disruptors of development. But really, when we think about it, disasters are the result of the development in the current status quo. Disasters taking place within the neoliberal paradigm are a visual evidence, a kind of visual representation of neoliberalism as a process. And within this lies the fundamental tension. Disaster can be a threat to a state, yet neoliberalism drives the production of vulnerability. And so, current disaster risk reduction approaches very often see disasters as this one-off, again, as I said already, unexpected events, rather than as socio-political processes. And this is reflected in disaster risk reduction measures that can displace the disaster temporarily, but actually they leave underlying factors that create disasters in the first place, absolutely unaddressed and untouched. And so what is accomplished is neoliberal restructuring, right? So we are kind of removing the public goods, we are privatizing public assets, we are deregulating major industries, reducing corporate taxes, I can go on. And all of this is traded for a belief in personal responsibility and for a belief that the role of the state is to really regulate the market and not to deliver the social good. And of course, the nature and degree of these factors changes by the state, and it changes in different contexts of disasters, but the fundamental elements are there. But there is a hope, it's not that bad, and you are that hope, you're the future. Disaster risk reduction is really a difficult task, otherwise we would have solved all the problem. And it could only happen if we actually contribute to it all together. In the current season of Disasters Deconstructed podcast with my convert, again, Jason von Medding, we've been engaging with early career researchers. And it's been the most inspiring season because early career researchers have really showed that they don't fear challenging the norms, right? They don't fear challenging the ideas that have really been kind of dominating the disaster studies field. And they're amazing at working together with communities and working for communities. And it's just been wonderful to hear. And a lot is also happening on the ground. There is a lot of movement and there are lots of people working together on the ground. And I think COVID pandemic was quite a good demonstration in that whilst the inequality has been exacerbated and enhanced, many people nevertheless around the world really stood in solidarity to kind of resist what state has been doing. And so the framing and narrative that disasters are unexpected and that disasters are natural create an illusion that seems real. And your chat calls that hypernormalization. And in this framing, it is the story and not the reality that matters. Because that story that we are hearing through the narrative of resilience, through the narrative of building back better, is that there is a happily ever after. But what that story is not telling us is that, that happily ever after will only be for very few, like we've seen in the story of the Three Little Pigs. And such ending, we are not there. We are nowhere near achieving that ending. And so, the main hope is through solidarity. We need to mobilize to challenge disaster risk creation and to ensure that we are working all together. And by we, I mean academics, practitioners, communities all around the world. We need to act together for the benefit of those who are most affected by disasters. In other words, those who are oppressed, those who are on the margin. We need to be very careful in how we use resilience as an aspiration for disaster risk reduction. And many international efforts hide behind this apolitical framing, which masks really significant realities of everyday life. True solutions to disaster risk reduction, they have to be grounded in the narratives that really reveal historic segregation, colonialism, marginalization, and other deep-rooted structural processes. Furthermore, disaster risk reduction efforts need to be grounded in comprehensive understanding of local struggles for social justice. And in order to contribute to the shift from disaster risk production to disaster risk reduction, we need to be more deliberate in the words that we use and more deliberate in the actions that are implied in this role. So we must push back against short-term profit orienteering and also of course, the headline grabbing framing of disasters. When we speak about disasters, we need to talk about systemic root causes. We need to talk about oppression. We need to talk about marginalization. What we say and do when it comes to disaster risk reduction shouldn't be about hazards, but should be about ethics, power, equity, responsibility, and of course, hope. Because for as long as we have hope, we fight. And for as long as we fight, we can resist disaster risk creation together. Thank you.
So thank you. Do we have any questions, please? Okay.
I just had one like, I have a opinion and a question. It's not controversial, but when we talk about building back better and building forward better, like the narrative change the narrative to building forward better. Because the policymakers, the decision makers are power to change that narrative with the policies that come into place. And we have this whole idea of disasters being a window of opportunity for us to change. Does it also give the government the leverage to actually not work for people who are vulnerable and also just promote development in terms of just having more buildings, more physical infrastructure, and ensuring, because we know people who were vulnerable before also.
Sure.
But still stay vulnerable because they weren't even able to cope up with the previous status, right? And now all of a sudden they're supposed to live in this better forward, which so the entire narrative to change isn't it important for the policymakers and the decision makers to actually be supporting of this idea of making the vulnerability, like reducing vulnerability?
Of course, yeah. That is the whole idea. That all the efforts for disaster risk reduction need to be about challenging and addressing the root causes, right? The kind of the marginalization, the vulnerability, and engaging with people who are vulnerable rather than saying, "Oh, I think you're vulnerable in that way. I'm going to come and solve your vulnerability for you."
So how do we get there? Like, how do we make them change?
Million dollar
It's always about economic growth and like development, but in that regard, we're actually just limited.
$1 million question, well, it's about political power, right? And electing, so elections is one way to do it, a very kind of naive way, right? But really resisting the power that creates policy in the first place. There is no simple answer to that.
Before I ask a question, I just want to comment from Professor Ilan Kelman.
Hi, Ilan.
He comments, you rightly raise concern about neoliberalism producing disaster risk, which ideologies do not. Question mark. Thank you.
Sorry, could you read that again?
Because he has the comment that.
I can see it's over, yeah. Hang on. Yeah. Oh yeah, okay. Yeah, the question about ideologies. I think here, you know, the kind of this is not okay. Let me kind of start from scratch. So the whole point of neoliberalism, as you know, I'm talking to you now here, is kind of deregulation, right? And whilst all ideologies may play a role in creating disaster risks, it's that personal responsibility and the belief that, you know, we can make a change on our own and that the state doesn't need to support us is the biggest problem with neoliberalism. And neoliberal capitalism in particular is kind of, again, it's all about kind of profiteering, right, and exploitation. It is built on marginalization. Marxism may call for better, right? Leninism may call for better, socialism may call for better, but we haven't seen the real manifestation of these ideologies as, you know, in real world, so to say. We know that what happened in the Soviet Union was statism, right? I think it's a bigger philosophical question. And I do think that ideology is needed because it gives us values that we may argue for, right? In order to understand what disaster risk is. But it takes a kind of much bigger exploration, and much bigger discussion, which I'm not prepared to have today, but we will. So
I'm sure you're hearing.
Yeah. And it's coming to my question is, do you think such languages from different culture can give the disaster risk as different framework?
So different understanding of kind of disaster
Yes,
risk.
yeah, I mean, different languages could give the different standards or framework or structure to the disaster risk.
I think they would, because languages reflect cultures, right? And we know that cultural understanding of disaster risk is very different, and therefore response would be very, very different. What's happening, the reason I talked about languages here is because what we've seen on the ground, for example, is that communities started using the words such as resilience, for instance, for the sake of NGOs and academics that come and work with them. But resilience is meaningless in their cultures, right? So that word resilience may be translated, but it doesn't mean anything in daily life. So if we go and ask, you know, I don't know, woman at the market, resilience would mean absolutely nothing to her, right? It wouldn't be the word that is used in day-to-day practice. And so understanding what cultural equivalent of resilience is, if there is indeed one, may help policymakers and researchers and NGOs to actually understand what matters when it comes to disaster risk reduction. Does it make sense?
Thing concern about me is with, because I'm Chinese, from the Chinese background and in the Korean language, Japanese and Vietnamese, I did a little bit of research on how do we translate natural disaster or natural hazards, and most of them give the same translation in that term. So do you think that could be some sort of code misleading the policymaker that they just ignore some human-made stuff, such as mobility or some stuff, or focus on the natural stuff?
Okay, so I speak Mandarin, so I know which, you know, it's Duran Zai Hai, right? We actually had that very long conversation. So in Vietnamese, in Mandarin, the literal translation is natural disaster, right? So the natural element is there. So what we are arguing for is not banning the language, right? We're not calling to stop saying natural disasters. What we are calling for is reframing the understanding that disasters are not a product of nature, right? That the disaster isn't because the earthquake happens. Earthquake doesn't causes disaster. It's our inability to use building codes, right? And putting people in buildings where they shouldn't be, that causes disaster, right? And so when we translate that from, for example, English, that needs to be clearly explained and represented rather than just banning the Rhine part of the word. But at the same time, we don't know what word is used culturally to explain disasters. And that might give us an insight at how disaster is understood, because we know that disasters don't have universal understanding. For depending on the culture, what we see, flood, for example, for us is a disaster, but to many communities in Andhra Pradesh and India, it isn't, because that's where the livelihood is, right? And so this is exactly what we're trying to show, that there isn't a universal understanding of these terms, but they're being imposed because international frameworks are using Anglophone framework. Okay.
Probably got time for one more question.
I found a description of humanitarian practitioners who don't make a connection between the cognitive gap between disaster risk and where it comes from very illuminating and relevant to my experience. But my question is more on this co-option of disaster risk concept and language in kind of the expected kind of neoliberal political kind of campaigns that you've seen. Do you also see that kind of NGOification in the non-neoliberal political movements as something that occurs and something which has a positive negative effect on those political movements which could oppose those powers?
Do you mean in terms of kind of using the conceptual, the language?
And I guess I'm the process of like forming into these structures that are similar co-ops, like structures within NGOs rather than kind of broader social movements that you see.
I'm not sure I understand the question.
I guess I'm thinking of things like the environmental campaigns that move away from social broad movements that are focused on people into structures of charities, NGOs that try to create things through like campaigns and things like that. No. Okay.
No, sorry, Peter. Do you? I'm kind of sorry. I kind of got lost in the question.
Sorry.
So we'll take that as a comment. But okay, so you've got time for one more question. Then,
Okay, anyone has a burning question? Yeah. Okay, so I came into disaster risk reduction from international development. And one of the first things I sort of noticed was why aren't you looking at the underlying issues? Why are you just addressing you putting plaster or band-aid? Does this then mean that your call is more for bringing wider discourse that is already happening into disaster risk reduction, rather than figuring out? Because I feel that your talk has bits to it that I think is wonderful, but I can't understand it because I haven't been trained to pick it up. So I don't know the international development bit, so I think, oh yes, we always talk about structural inequalities, only we don't know what to do about it, but we talk about it. So is it as simple as that, or is it actually something a bit more that I don't understand because my training is wanted to do?
No, I think you understand it perfectly well. It is indeed that, you know, that we very often want to reinvent the wheel, right? And in fact, many disaster scholars are coming from very technocratic kind of backgrounds, right? Technical backgrounds, technical training, or natural science. And therefore, that is reflected in what we understand as disasters. And very few engage with theory, very few engage with politics. And that's what's needed, right? Because that allows us to help to understand broader issues and then perhaps find solutions that are already there. But that is not happening. There is a lot of siloed approach to what disasters are and how they should be treated.
Okay, so thank you very much indeed. thing, I think we'll be heading to the house room. Do you want to join us for a drink? So
Perfect,
if anyone
thanks.
wants to join us, do please just congregate here and we'll walk over together. Thank you very much.
Shall I lock you up there?
Yeah.
We have
Anybody
to
do
have
anything?
a second.
Thank you.